So we're going to talk about IT4IT and how IT4IT, in my opinion, is a game changer for the future of the function and the work that we do in IT. Before I jump into the conversation, how many of you have heard of IT4IT before today? Okay, a couple of you. For the two of you, how much have you actually looked into IT4IT? Is it just basically you heard about it, or you've looked into it, you've researched it, you know everything there is to know about it? Okay. Very good.
High level.
Very high level. Okay. Good. Well, hopefully we'll dig into it a little bit here today. You'll get some things that you haven't seen, some perspective that will be new to you, and hopefully it'll give you a better sense of what IT4IT really is. The topics we're going to cover, I'm going to give you a high-level overview of IT4IT and why we need it. I'm going to talk about the three key components of IT4IT, the IT value chain, the IT4IT service model, and the IT4IT reference architecture. And we'll get into the importance of some of the different pieces. And then the question that always comes up is how IT4IT and ITIL fit together, so I'm going to spend a little time talking about that to make sure that folks understand. So, as we start the conversation, what I wanted to start with was some real-world problems. These are things that we've heard very specifically from individuals. So there's a UK retailer who's having trouble understanding business command for his services. He's trying to organize his delivery teams in ways that will have more effective methodologies for delivery. And he needs to have the ability to oversee his IT services and align them with business objectives. Another gentleman, this is not a quote, but it's pretty darn close. I was in the room when he shared this with us. This European supply chain executive who would come into IT, was running IT now, at a fairly large multinational. He shared with us that when he was in the supply chain organization, IT was giving him all sorts of analytics and data to be able to run his business. The minute he came over the wall and into the IT function, he no longer had data to understand how the organization was functioning, how he could drive his business more effectively, how he could drive improvement into IT. So that was a really important thing, that he didn't have the information he needed to make the business decisions to drive improvement. And then we saw an architecture executive report in one of the Fortune 100 companies that we worked with, where they really looked at all of the different pieces of work in IT, and what they saw was point solutions. IT operations management, project management, IT service management were all very siloed, very point solutions. The processes weren't aligned, the tools weren't integrated, the data, the metrics, none of that stuff fit together. And everywhere they looked in their IT organization, they saw silos. Silos between development and operations, silos between project managers and architects, silos all over the organization. So that caused friction, slowed down their organization, and really drove a lot of additional cost into the picture. So, and these things are not unique. The genesis of IT4IT was actually about 7-8 years ago to try and address some of these kinds of problems. Companies, big and small, have been dealing with these issues for a long time. We don't spend a lot of time focusing on ourselves when it comes to what we do with IT. We really focus on driving business value, but at some point we need to turn that lens in on ourselves and apply our best practice of enterprise architecture to how we do our work. And that's what IT4IT ultimately really was all about. Now, what is it? It's a standard. It's an open standard coming from the open group. So it's the same folks that manage TOGAF, that manage Unix, and manage a number of other standards. It is designed to really help us cut across the different silos of the organization, to really help understand how data needs to flow throughout the management of the business of IT to work more effectively. And One of the things that you'll see as you look at it is that it applies to technology and the management technology wherever that lives. In today's digital world, technology isn't always owned by the IT function. Technology, regardless of where it's owned, still needs to be operated and managed. And so this approach can actually be taken into the business and used in the chief marketing office or the chief digital office, if those folks are the folks that are now managing different pieces of the technology. It's not just for the IT function. So why does it matter? IT4IT, and you can see the visuals for those three key pieces that we'll talk about in a few minutes, the value chain, the service model, and the reference architecture. It's really an incredibly valuable tool for helping a company transform their IT operating model to support their business strategies. It's a way to actually drive total cost of ownership out of managing the IT function. It's a way to enable additional productivity out of your IT capacity. And one of the things I'd like to highlight as we talk about IT4IT is how it's different from other management frameworks that have come before it. IT4IT has a very heavy business perspective in it. We use the business strategy technique of the quarter value chain as a core foundational element of what we do with IT4IT to create this IT value chain. Let's see if I can work the pointer. That wasn't it. There. So this is the IT value chain. That is really helping us focus on how is IT delivering value to the business and the organization. And we'll do that. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But in addition to the business perspective and the business focus, IT4IT also is bringing a service orientation. So IT4IT really has come about since the advent of the cloud. And so there really has been some considerable thought put into how does a service evolve through its life cycle, and how as IT professionals should we be managing the services that we're providing. So we'll talk about that when we talk about the service model here, about that service orientation and how that really plays out. The third way IT4IT is different is it's focused on interoperability. And we'll talk some more about this again as we go through the discussion today, but if you look at other IT management frameworks like IDLE or COVID or even PMI or TOGAF or things like that, the vast majority of them are focused on business processes and best practices. IT4IT, from a reference architecture perspective, is in TOGAF terms an information systems architecture. It talks about the application components that you need, and it talks about the data that you need. And there is a heavy focus on how that data needs to interoperate across the flow of the organization. How does data need to flow from one part of the organization to another? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the reference architecture. So let's talk a little bit about the different pieces. So again, that first piece, the concept of IT4IT having an IT value chain. You guys have all heard of the Porter value chain business strategy technique, correct? Anybody not heard of that? Okay. Well, one of the things that happens is we really don't use that technique on ourselves. And so what we did with IT4IT is we actually applied Porter value chain approach to managing the business of IT. If you're going to run your IT shop as a business, this is what will come out of that. And so it really describes the IT value chain through the life cycle of the service in 4 distinct value streams. Those value streams are strategy to portfolio, which is really all about the key planning processes. Enterprise architecture, since we're all architects here presumably in this conversation, enterprise architecture is going to fit in here. Requirement to deploy, which is all about the process to actually build or procure the services that we're going to offer is the second value stream. That one is where the solution architecture role typically is going to come into play, is really helping in the detailed design of the services that we have. The third is the request to fulfill role, which is value stream, which is all about service delivery. It's about how we're going to deliver those services to market. This is what really drives a key element of the service orientation of IT4IT. There's an entire value stream that talks to what that process is of delivering services to our customers and how that particular process fits with the other processes of the organization. And then the last of the four value streams is detect and correct. And that's really the process of operating and running the services that we provide. Now, just like any value chain model, there is a set of value streams and there's a set of supporting activities. So there are things that we need to do that aren't critical to delivering value to the organization as an IT function, but that you couldn't actually run IT without being able to do. So things like governance and sourcing and analytics and financials and things like that will show up as the supporting activities. So that's really the IT value chain, and this gives us a mental model to get everybody in the organization on the same page. And we'll talk in a couple minutes about the connection between this and the reference architecture. But you can show this picture, and it's really the first picture that I have seen in my 25 years of working in IT. It's the first picture that describes how IT works in a way that you could show to any executive in the organization, and they will get it like that. Doesn't matter if they know IT or not. They've worked with core value chains. They know this strategy technique, and they can make sense of this. And your IT leaders also can make sense of this. They can see where they sit. They can see what part of the organization they manage. They can see how that kind of plays out in this. So it's a really powerful technique to get the organization on the same page, to really bring focus to what we do and how it all ties together. And I think I probably ruined most of the slides there to talk through all of it, but one of the things that it does add value that I didn't talk about is the fact that if we can tie our work as architects back to a model like this, it's a lot easier for us to describe the relationship between IT and the value we're trying to drive in IT to the overall enterprise strategies. It's also a lot easier for us to be clear with the organization on the importance of the investments that we're making in how we do work in IT and what impact those are going to have. So I'll give you an example of this. We were working with a client over in Europe to really do an analysis on this model and looking at their overall IT function. And they had some in-flight work if I go back for a second, to really drive a major initiative to improve their requirements and deployment process, their build process. They were going to really rethink that. They were going to bring in agile techniques. They were going to bring in new ways of building, new processes for developing code. They were going to bring in new tools. And when we sat down and we looked at their organization from a value chain perspective, what came out was, yes, they could do that work and they would get some level of benefit to the organization, but they didn't have good process in the strategy and portfolio space. They didn't have clarity on decision making around what work was going to get done. So until they fixed that, until they knew that they were doing the right work, it didn't matter that they were doing the work better, right? So that was the intervention that we made with them, was to say, yes, you can keep this project going if you want, but if you don't do an intervention over here in the strategy and portfolio space, you're actually not going to benefit the organization at all. So we actually helped them queue up a new piece of work to drive some thinking into strategy portfolio so that they would get the benefit out of the other work that they were going to try and do. So that's a really nice way to use this value chain holistically, looking across the IT function. Oh, sorry. So the next element of this is the IT4IT service model and how IT4IT is really all about service delivery. Let me check on our time. 11:09. When are we done? Does anybody know? 11:30. Okay. So IT4IT is really all about service delivery. There's a heavy service orientation to IT4IT. And the reason why, and why we talk about this is because ultimately at the end of the day, when we talk about IT, everything that we're delivering back to the business is consumed as a service, right? And that's really the way to think about it from a starting point. Services obviously are much bigger than something like a provisioning server or something like that. So if that was all it was, we wouldn't need this kind of stuff. But when we think about services more holistically and from a business value perspective, having this orientation really becomes beneficial. There's a number of things that need to go into a service. It's not just what you're delivering. It's also what's the performance requirements, what's the metrics you're going to measure service with, what's the SLA you're going to have, what's the construct you're actually going to do delivery with. How are you going to automate service delivery into this? So it's really about understanding the business outcomes you're trying to drive with that service, as well as that service provides to the organization as a whole. And when we look at IT4IT, what it does is it helps us change our conversation with the organization. It helps us talk about the services that we're providing versus talk about point technology solutions. And so we find that to be very, very, very valuable. Now, to the point of the IT4IT service model, the service model is the evolution of a service throughout its life cycle. Okay? So it starts as something that's just an idea, a conceptual service, and then it evolves as we start to build it out or define it for purchase or things like that into a logical service model. And that logical service model really is what we're going to use as a blueprint to help us create the physical or the realized service when the customer asks for it. And so we'll have this realized service model that really is what will actually be delivered back to the business. Now, when we work this in a kind of a full, robust environment, the logical service model is what gets shared with the organization in a service catalog. And that's really the model that has everything that the business user needs to make that decision on whether or not they want to purchase or consume this service. And then as that service gets subscribed to or purchased by the end user, it gets translated into the realized service model, which is then managed throughout the life cycle. Now, this concept is really defined in the reference architecture, which we'll look at in a little more detail in a minute, in something called the service backbone. Okay? This service backbone, if you look at the reference architecture picture when we look at it on the next slide, will be the purple boxes or the purple circles along the bottom of that picture. But that service backbone really is tracking the service through its metamorphosis, through its life cycle. And it really evolves over the entire life of the service. And it gives us traceability from idea all the way out to the physical configuration items that are used to deliver that service. Now, this is important because it really drives a number of different conversations for us that we're trying to do to be more effective when it comes to managing the IT business. It gives us traceability. It gives us a way to track usage. It gives us a way to understand and drive pricing and costing and chargeback. It gives us a way to support automation of our IT processes a little bit differently. And by having the IT value chain and the service backbone related to each other, what we can do is we can actually see how the service is flowing between each of the value streams through each of the different parts of the organization that are driving work. What we're starting to get here is a little bit of the context of the organization instead of just the content. If I think about the next picture where we'll look at all of the different pieces of work, the more granular things that happen in an IT organization, whether that be configuration management or incident management or build or project management or whatever it might be, those are, to me, many times those are going to be individuals' roles that are doing that work. It's the content of their work. It's the work that they do every day. Maybe it's one of the blocks, maybe it's a couple of the blocks. But you get really good at the work you do on a day in and day out basis. You get good at your content. What a lot of people don't do, because they've got to focus on that, is they get stuck in that little silo and they don't look out beyond that. So they don't see the context. And that's one of the things that IT4IT tries to help do, is provide the context, the connection points, so you can see what's really needed to flow work across the organization and eliminate friction in your IT function. So part of what we're doing with this standard is to really try and drive this into the tools that vendors are providing for the industry. We're trying to create each of these data objects and the connection points to create a standard API, so that out of the box, your project, if it's an IT4IT compliant tool, your project management system is going to talk to your enterprise architecture system. Your help desk system is going to talk to your build system. So we're trying to drive that conversation right now with the vendors to help make this be a standards-based open process, so that we can improve and drive this across the industry. Now, the last key element here that we're talking about is that IT4IT reference architecture. And again, one of the key pieces of this reference architecture is the idea that people get it. And if you've never seen the picture before, other than that little thing that you couldn't read a couple of slides ago, hopefully you'll recognize yourself in this next picture. But it's really been very effective in my personal experience as a way for people to see themselves in the IT organization and where their work is and how it fits with everything else. I haven't found anybody yet that at least has been willing to admit to me that they couldn't find themselves on the map, right? And that's very different from some of the other reference models that we have in the IT industry, some of the other frameworks like IDLE and COVID. There's a lot of detail, there's a lot of great content in both of those, so I'm not trying to disparage either of those in any way, shape, or form, to be clear. Great content, they work well with IT4IT, and I highly recommend them. But they do take someone that's fairly knowledgeable to really get the value out of them, because they are a little bit esoteric, they are complex, they're hard to understand. IT4IT, one of the key things that it's trying to do is it's trying to help make it easier for people to understand the bigger picture. So there's the map. It's a little bit light, so it's a little tough to read. But if any of you, you'll see here in the last slide my contact information. If you're interested in more information about IT4IT, if you want to get a copy of the reference architecture, or you want to get a copy of this map or any of that kind of stuff, just send me an email or a Skype message or whatever it is, and I'd be happy to share a lot of extra information for you. But people can find themselves in this map. So as I mentioned, the enterprise architects will see themselves up here. The developers are going to see a lot of things that they interact with and engage with here under the requirements and the source control. Project managers will find themselves here in projects and interactions with portfolio. And operations is going to find itself in a lot of the elements over here and what they do. So anybody look at this and not see where they live? It's okay. I want somebody to challenge me.
So go back to your original slide. I will ask you that question.
The original slide, which
It was the very first slide you put this together. Yeah, take that one.
this one?
Yeah. Where is the business engagement coming?
Business engagement.
Because that's the front of the portfolio, strategy and portfolio.
Business engagement is going to come in the strategy to portfolio process. And where that really comes into play, if we look at that is specifically this portfolio demand component. So business relationship managers play in that portfolio demand and are a key input into the portfolio demand component. Now, to your point, a lot of the day in and day out client interactions and some of that stuff is not explicitly called out in that model. And that's actually a really good one, because that's a little bit of a failing in the model that hopefully will get adjusted in the next major release. But that's where it comes into play. Great question. All right, so you're the first one. Anybody else not see themselves in the model? Anybody a solution architect? You said you were a solution architect. Do you see yourself? Where's solution architect going to show up? It's not called that, that's why
Service design.
you got it. Yep, absolutely. Okay. So, why is this important? And the picture, I think, actually covers up some of the words. But part of the importance of this is, in order for us to really drive the strategies of the organization, we have to get everybody on the same page. If we're really trying to drive productivity within the IT function, we need the organization to be all talking the same language, right? In order to reduce friction in the organization, we need the organization to all be talking the same language. We need them to see how they fit with everything else going on around them and what those key connection points are. And so that's really one of the key pieces of why this works. So my colleague and I, Dan, he and I have done a lot of work together on IT4IT with different clients and whatnot. One of the things that we have really seen is that trying to do this with IDLE, trying to do this with COVID, trying to do this with other IT management frameworks like ITCMF or things like that, there's a lot of semantic issues that crop up. We struggle to get people aligned with those kinds of models. And what we found is that with IT4IT, we haven't experienced that. The semantics line up for people a lot more easily than they do with some of these other models. Every once in a while, for things like business relationship management was a good one, solution architecture is a good one. Maybe some people don't catch that because that little bit of light translation is needed to fit with the model, but usually we can talk very quickly from a common starting point. That enables us to get past that semantic difference in the arguments that occur there and really move forward very quickly. Now, I wanted to share a couple of success stories just so you get an idea of who is actually using this. These are some of the companies that have been willing to actually publish their success stories. It's interesting because this is, at the end of the day, still enterprise architecture work. It's enterprise architecture work focused on the IT function. And so we still run into the exact same problem that Paul was talking about earlier, which is enterprise architects don't talk about the good work that they do because it's strategic and it's a competitive advantage. Enterprise architects don't talk about the bad work that they do because nobody wants to talk about their screw-ups. So it's really tough to get people to talk about this. It's really tough to get people to share case studies and talk about how this has worked effectively for them. But we did get a few. And I can tell you that in addition to the companies that are up here, personal experience, I know of 5 of the Fortune 10 that either are already actively using IT4IT or are in the middle of an analysis of whether of how they're going to use it internally. And I would say probably 25 to 30% of the Fortune 100 are already engaged with it. There's some things, and I won't talk about the details of it here. I don't have the slide for that, but there is actually there's also an emergence model that's been put together for IT4IT that talks about how you can apply the reference architecture not just to the biggest companies in the world, but you can apply it to a company of any size. And the idea with that is that the work of the IT function doesn't fundamentally change whether you're 2 people in a garage or you're Shell and you have a $10 billion IT budget. What changes is how much of that work gets done in your head versus how much of that work gets written down and has to get passed from people to people because you've got one person doing everything versus 10,000 people doing each of their own individual little bits and pieces at scale. So there's actually a model on which of the different functional components of that reference architecture do you actually formalize first, and then second, and whatnot, so that you can actually use this architecture as a company evolves and grows over time, and you can use it as a way to kind of build out different pieces to drive your overall IT productivity as you go forward. So I mentioned IT4IT and IDLE, very, very common question. They do fit very, very nicely together. This picture kind of talks about some of the different standards in the standards landscape that we think about from an architecture perspective. So if you think about the business verticals or the industries, you'll see different reference architectures that you may recognize, like BIAN or Accord or ARTS. If you think about some of the shared functions that are within an organization, like supply chain or finance, you'll see some of the standards like SCORE or GAP. IT4IT is ultimately a standard for the IT function, and it connects in with some of these other standards that I've already mentioned, like TOGAF or SAFe or IDLE. The way that it connects is in its level of prescriptiveness. Most of those other standards are really very narratively focused. IDLE, for example, is 3,000 plus pages of text, textual description of business processes and best practices. IT4IT is very different in that it's a prescriptive reference architecture. So it's actually only about, the entire standard is less than 200 pages. It's much more prescriptive and specific, and it doesn't play in the business process space. It actually plays in the application in the data space and in the strategy space. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. More specifically, to look at IT4IT and IDLE, if you kind of think about some of the origins for IDLE, obviously IDLE has been around for a long time and has been used very effectively in a lot of different organizations. IDLE is strongest in the operations space. It does have a little bit of coverage in all the way across the entire chain, but it's really got the highest quality information in the operations space, and that's where it's used most effectively. Again, it's really focused on how do you apply best practices. This is targeted at CIOs, senior IT leaders, enterprise architects, solution architects, as a tool to be able to use to actually change how you do the work within IT. It's not designed to be a tool to implement a specific set of best practices for change management, as an example. It is run by an open standards body, which is also a little bit different than IDLE. You may or may not know IDLE is run by a company called Axelos. So it is actually privately held and managed, which is a little bit of a different animal. IDLE also, by and large, there's some white papers and extensions to IDLE that talk about agile approaches and DevOps trends, but IDLE is largely waterfall, largely a top-down way of thinking. With IT4IT, we've tried very, very hard to make sure that we've incorporated Agile and DevOps right into the model in a way that we were clear that it didn't matter whether you were waterfall or whether you were Agile. It didn't matter whether you were doing DevOps or not. The model still holds true and the model still works. So this just kind of shows some of the mapping of the IT4IT value streams to the different books of knowledge that come in IDLE, if you're familiar with this. IDLE has service strategy, service design, service transformation, service operations, and continuous improvement as the 5 books of IDLE. And then you can see the different value streams and how they kind of map and tie in. And then one more slide here. This just kind of, from an architecture perspective, talks about how IT4IT and the other IT management frameworks really fit together. I've talked a little bit about this, but it tries to highlight for you, looking at some of the different layers, how the two fit together. So IT4IT really does play at the strategy level up above the architecture components. The other frameworks tie in at a business architecture level, describing process and capabilities. And then IT4IT comes back in and the information systems architecture, being prescriptive about the data, the flows of the data, the applications you need to support. And then Archimate, BPMN, and UML, and some of those other things become basically meta models for supporting the different work of the IT function. So that's it. I work for a company called CC&C Solutions. We're a global IT strategy and architecture consulting and training company. We offer training services. We offer BA startup and restart services, IT transformation services. We help companies go through this IT4IT journey and apply IT4IT, use IT4IT as a way to drive improvement to their IT function. And why am I here talking to you? Because actually I sit on the global steering committee for IT4IT and have been helping to evolve the standard over the last couple of years very specifically. I've been working in the IT4IT space as a segment architect for IT4IT for almost 10 years now. I spent 8 years at Procter & Gamble doing this work. Was actually a part of the consortium as it got started, and then stepped away from the consortium a little bit once they brought it into the open group, joined back up. And so it's something I believe very passionately in. I think it is something that is transforming how we think about work in IT, and it's driving, for the companies that I've seen it used in, it's a very effective tool for driving transformation of the IT function. My contact information is here if you'd like to connect, learn more. I do have a really nice list of the best links on IT4IT to give you some additional information about it. If it's an area of interest to you, I'd be happy to send you that list of links. It's got videos, it's got articles, it's got a link to the reference architecture. So if any of you want that, just send me a note. And thank you for your time. Questions? I know we're at 11:30. We got started a little bit, but I'm happy to take questions as long as you guys... Okay, then we got plenty of time for questions. Questions on this? Yes, I think all of them will be shared on the website, but I got to verify that with Paul. I know they usually share everything on the website. If you need it sooner than they share it, just send me an email and I can send it right away.
Those groups are there, but they form each company they call horizontals or verticals, like supply chain and finance or enabling, those kind of things. So that particular horizontal carries a piece of everything. How much is that common, or how is that changing?
So I think that's a really good question. So there's a lot of different ways that companies choose to procure IT services. There's a lot of different ways that companies choose to organize their IT function. Some of them, to your point, embed all of their IT out in the vertical business units or the vertical functions. Some organizations centralize all those different elements. One of the things that we find in looking at this is that By being an industry standard model, it allows you to talk through that regardless of the organizational structure that's applied. Right? It allows you to talk through that regardless of whether you're doing cloud or not. If you think about cloud, for example, because that's a really good, easy way to share. If I go back to that slide, what cloud is doing, one of the biggest things that cloud is doing for companies that used to do all internal development, is cloud is actually taking and picking up several of these boxes and moving into a different provider. Cloud providers still have to do that work. Somebody still has to do the work. It's just not in your organization anymore. It's done by somebody else. Outsourcing was the same thing. Outsourcing picked up different pieces of this and handed it over to other organizations to drive the conversation on. The different organizational structures are the same way. You may have your organization structured so that there's a single strategy and portfolio process. Maybe there's a single architecture team, a PMO, that's driving the decision making around your planning processes. Maybe you've got development teams that are sitting out in the business units. So maybe they've got, for every project, they're running a unique development chain. Maybe some of the processes in the finance division are different than the processes in the HR division, or more likely, maybe some of the processes supporting supply chain are different than the processes supporting the e-commerce department, right? So this is where the bimodal conversation comes in. You might choose to do your requirement to deployment processes differently for e-commerce, where you bring in a lot more agile and DevOps and try and drive a lot more agility and speed into it. And you may stay more waterfall in your processes if you're in the supply chain division. Now, neither one of those changes fundamentally the work that has to be done, the application that's needed to support that, or the data that needs to flow from parts of the organization to effectively do IT. And I didn't mention this, but this picture highlights the service backbone. The reference architecture actually has data objects for every single component on here. So the full reference architecture has a whole bunch of additional circles on this picture, and all the different flows. I actually need to swap this picture out, put that other one on there, because this is quite as descriptive. I didn't notice that before. But again, to the point, it doesn't matter if you're doing Agile or Waterfall. The data that has to flow from your project component into your requirement component or your source component or whatever it is still the same. You're just handling it in a different process to pass that data back and forth. That make sense? Does that answer the question? Okay. Any other questions? All right.
Where are you based out of?
I am based out of Cincinnati, Ohio. Our company is headquartered in Sydney, Australia. And if you're interested in the topic of restarting enterprise architecture in an era of digital transformation, I will be back here this afternoon to talk with that. So, thanks for your time. Hope you enjoyed it, and enjoy lunch. Thanks.